Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 94 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Who are you friends with, and why are you friends with them? Today's episode has me thinking a lot about friendship and how and why I'm friends with people. I like to be friends with smart, loyal people who share at least a few of my interests, and who often challenge me to think about and try new things. A sense of humor and a love of ice cream help too, because, let's be honest, some situations require a good joke and a scoop of mint chip. The reason I'm thinking about my friends and why we're friends is because if we lived in the early American Republic, I'm not sure I could be friends with many of my existing friends. Because the process of forming and maintaining friendships in the early Republic, especially friendships between men and women, was different. Today, Cassandra Good, author of Founding Friendships, Friendships Between Men and Women in the Early American Republic, joins us to explore, friendship in the early Republic. Specifically, we're going to investigate what it was like for men and women to be friends with each other. During our conversation, Cassie reveals the dynamics of friendship between men and women in the early Republic, why men and women formed friendships with members of the opposite sex, and the benefits early Republic men and women derived from having cross-sex friendships. But first, I'm hosting my largest book giveaway yet, and it will take place at the end of the week. If you enjoy history and love the idea of free history books, you should join the Ben Franklin's World listener community on Facebook. That's where I host the book giveaways, and that's also where I ask you to submit your questions for our guest historians. It's free to join the community. All you need to do is visit benfranklinsworld.com and click on the orange Join Now button on the home screen, or text BFWorld to 33444. Are you ready to discover more about friendships in the early American Republic? Let's go meet our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest is an associate editor of the Papers of James Monroe, a documentary editing project at the University of Mary Washington. Her research interests include politics, culture, and gender during the early Republic period, and today she joins us to discuss her award-winning book, Founding Friendships, Friendships Between Men and Women in the Early American Republic. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Cassandra Good.
Thank you.
Cassie, in Founding Friendships, you investigate what it was like for men and women to be friends between the 1780s and 1830s. Would you tell us what attracted you to this project? Because today it seems pretty commonplace for men and women to be friends. So why and how was this type of friendship different during the early Republic period?
I actually came across the idea for this project as an undergrad when I was doing research for my undergraduate thesis, and I was reading the letters of a woman named Margaret Bayard Smith, who was a great source for the early Republic. Her husband published the local newspaper, and she was friends with Thomas Jefferson, and she wrote about how difficult it was for her to say goodbye when he was leaving Washington at the end of his presidency in 1809, and she talked about holding his hand for 5 or 6 minutes, and just how emotional that experience was. And initially, I thought that this must have been some kind of affair. And then I realized, through talking to other professors and reading more, that actually friends could talk about friendship in this way, and friendship could be that emotional, even between a man and woman. And once that was sort of unlocked, I realized that I had seen a lot of this. I just hadn't identified it. So, in fact, yeah, you're right. It was fairly common for elite men and women to be friends. In some ways, strangely, it is very similar to friendship today in terms of the fact that it can be complicated and risky, and that people might misunderstand it as romantic rather than a friendship. But the risks for that misunderstanding, especially for women in the early Republic, were just much greater, because a risk to their reputation, especially tied to sexuality, could make them unable to be married, which pretty much left them in the lurch financially. It could be quite dangerous for women. Also, there's this whole mess of writing about seduction in this period, and women are worried about about when men are worried about women being seduced. And that can happen, as the novels at least will tell you, through friendships with men. There's also the fact that there are more rules in general for how to conduct a friendship of any sort in this period, and especially between men and women. There's just more rules of etiquette in general that people follow, portman of how to interact properly with each other, how to write letters properly, and that becomes especially acute for male-female friends.
It really seems like there were many dangers in having friendships with members of the opposite sex. So, what was the attraction? What could friendship with a man provide a woman, and what could friendship with a woman provide a man that same-sex friendships just couldn't supply?
Well, I think in some ways, men and women gain some of the same things from these friendships: emotional support, intellectual companionship. They could see each other as surrogate family, get practical help. But there are particular benefits. So for men, if they're trying to court a woman, a female friend who's friends with the woman they're interested in too, or even in some cases not even friends with that woman, can serve as a go-between for the man, because there were a lot of rules too about courtship and men and women being able to communicate with each other in that phase. So a female friend could be very helpful as a go-between in providing advice in a circumstance like that. And for women who are friends, especially with older men who might be able to be a patron or a man who is a politician, they're getting access to power, patronage, and influence through those male friends.
Is power, patronage, and influence what attracted Abigail Adams to form a friendship with Thomas Jefferson? Adams was older than Jefferson, but she was an intelligent woman who enjoyed having access to political power.
Yeah, absolutely. She does get access to power both through her husband and through Jefferson, but he also accesses political information through her. So there are times where he writes letters, often on the same day, to John and Abigail Adams. And if he's not getting the information he wants from John Adams, he'll say to Abigail, "Can you tell me what's going on?" So there's partially that political bond and benefit for them. There's also the fact that I think both of them just had a really intellectual connection and an emotional connection. So they found support in one another that way. When they met, Jefferson had been widowed not long before. So this emotional kind of connection with a female friend would be important. And, John Adams too is a very different sort of figure than Thomas Jefferson. So, a marriage isn't going to give all of the emotional and intellectual benefits a person gets in their life. And I think Jefferson filled in some of those areas that maybe John Adams didn't. So for Abigail, this is a different type of person that you get different things from.
It's almost like we can see a reciprocal friendship or relationship of equals between Abigail Adams and Thomas Jefferson from the way you describe their friendship. And this seems a bit odd in the early Republic, given the legal principle of coverture, where men legally controlled the lives and property of their wives. Did friendship between men and women really provide a way for the sexes to achieve equal standing?
Yeah, I think fairly close, or at least more egalitarian than any other relationship between a man and a woman in this period. As you say, in marriage, this idea of coverture, legally the man owns the wife as property. In some ways, this is a legal fiction. It doesn't always, play out. The woman obviously is a person and can talk, and so is not strictly property, but he does have a lot of control over her, and divorce is, not an easy option. So that is a different dynamic for marriage, whereas in a friendship with a man and a woman, the man in no way owns the woman. She can leave that relationship whenever she would like. She can, end the relationship, as Abigail actually chose to with Thomas Jefferson at a certain point, or start the relationship again, as again she did much later. So there is this opportunity for equal footing in a friendship, as there's sort of reciprocity going back and forth with favors and emotion and letters and gifts. And all of those factors built together make these relationships much closer to equality than others between men and women in the period.
In founding friendships, Cassie notes that it was natural for women with masculine intellects and men with effeminate and soft demeanors to cultivate friendships with members of the opposite sex. Cassie, what do you mean by masculine intellects and effeminate and soft demeanors? And why did it seem like men and women with these traits often cultivated relationships with members of the opposite sex?
Yeah, it's interesting in this period that women, especially elite women, are supposed to be educated in order to educate their sons to be Republican citizens and educate or at least talk about intellectual issues with their husbands who are also Republican citizens. But there's sort of a limit to this. They're not supposed to be too intellectual. Being too intellectual is seen as masculine in this period. So this sort of suggests that women are acting outside of gender norms if they're talking too much about intellectual issues. And certainly people leveled that kind of accusation against somebody like Abigail Adams and a lot of the other women I write about. And in terms of the men, it's interesting that in the first chapter, when I talked about 3 different pairs of friendships, all 3 of those men I talked about were described as having sort of feminine characteristics. And that didn't mean anything necessarily about their sexuality the way we might think today. But if you look at Thomas Jefferson first, his friend Margaret Bayard Smith describes him as having a manner and voice almost femininely soft and gentle. William Ellery Channing, another man I write about with a lot of female friends, his biographer said, "The feminine element, so strong in all men of genius, was dominant in his social nature. This attracted him to women." So there seems to be something that shows a little more gender flexibility. They're not in these strict roles as society defines them. And that, in some way, as Channing's biographer is saying, makes it more compatible for these men and women with these sort of gender flexible traits to be friends with one another.
It really seems like men and women had a lot of navigating to do within society and amongst themselves when they formed cross-sex relationships in the early republic. When we need to navigate something today, many of us turn to the internet. But in those pre-internet days of the early republic, when you couldn't just Google search something, men and women turned to books and articles for advice. Cassie, how did books and articles assist early republic men and women with creating and maintaining cross-sex friendships?
Yeah, if they had looked at advice books, which I'm sure they did, this was quite common for people to look at etiquette books, letter writing guides, sort of moral guides, they would have found some confusing advice because for the most part, these books suggest that friendships between men and women are either dangerous or they're impossible. There's one little poem in a book that warns the helpless fair, meaning women, in friendship with the other sex, be cautious, they, men, are apt to vex. And this is because men would pretend to be friends with a woman and use friendship as a phantom in the way to lead poor thoughtless girls astray. So this is going back to what I was talking about with seduction, that a lot of these advice books say, watch out being friends with a man. He might say he's friends with you just in order to seduce you. So there really wasn't a lot of practical advice on how to go about forming these friendships. They had to sort of make it up as they went along, piecing together what advice made sense for them.
Many early republic men and women tried to gain social acceptance for their cross-sex friendships by situating them within 5 different and acceptable social structures: mixed-sex social circles, the church, fictive kinship relationships, by including their husbands and wives in their cross-sex relationships, and by forming cross-sex friendships only when they were older and free from the imputation of sexual impropriety. Cassie, would you tell us about these social structures and which one you think proved the most effective in gaining social acceptance for cross-sex friendships?
Yeah, you're right. There are a variety of strategies that people use to gain social acceptance, to make sure that people understand that their friendship is safe and proper and not a sexual relationship. And, this is quite important to make sure that people understand the status of their friendship if they're going to stay friends. There are many cases where people use multiple strategies here. It might be that they, are part of a larger circle of friends and they use terms of fictive kinship, for instance. I think really the easiest situation for a woman, at least, to be in and have male friends is if she's an older widowed woman. There seems to be this idea that those women are somehow non-sexual. Usually there's not as much gossip around that kind of situation where there's an older woman who is friends with men. I think also it helps if you're married, you have to include the spouse pretty much in that case, especially if you're writing letters. And especially if you have pairs of spouses that are friends with one another. So John and Abigail Adams, and then Mercy Otis Warren and her husband, the 4 of them were all friends in a group. So I think that situation is really ideal.
Let's take a closer look at how cross-sex friendships worked in the early republic. How did men and women set about forming a friendship with a member of the opposite sex?
Yeah, I think in a lot of cases, these friendships are people that met growing up together or in the same social circles when they were young adults and out courting people. A lot of these relationships I look at are people in cities. There's more opportunities, especially in the northern cities, for men and women to gather in mixed sex spaces and meet each other. Some cases, though, they just met through a spouse. So that's how Abigail Adams meets Thomas Jefferson. John Adams was already friends with him. So that provides the introduction. They might meet through other social settings, such as their church. In a lot of cases, men and women within a religious congregation became friends. So it might not have been quite as easy to meet as today, and there was no official status like on Facebook friending somebody. But if they wanted to become friends and were married, the first step is sort of to get the husband's okay. The woman needs the husband's okay to begin a friendship. And if they're going to write one another, that's especially important.
Wives needed husbands' permission to form friendships with men. Did husbands need wives' permission to form friendships with women?
Husbands did not need the permission of their wives to become friends with other women, although we usually do see men referencing their wives if they are friends with a woman and trying to tie her into that friendship too, but he certainly didn't need her permission.
Earlier you mentioned that, like today, men and women would meet each other and become friendly in church. What did establishing opposite-sex friendships within the church look like, and did opportunities to form cross-sex relationships vary by denomination?
There were certain denominations that fostered this more, particularly the Quakers and evangelical Christians, and then later the Unitarians. All of these religious sects are groups that talk about things like a union of spirits, mingling of souls, the idea that people connect through souls and that the body is not as important. And so if you take out the body, they'll often say the soul doesn't have a sex, a gender. So those souls can connect and they're sort of ignoring the body. They also are able to use pretty effusive emotional language, usually in letters between male-female friends. They're not saying the word love or beloved. That, smacks a little bit too much of romantic love. But within the religious context, that was okay, in part because those friendships were a way of connecting to God. So the idea is God sort of triangulated in that relationship the way a spouse might in a non-religious relationship. So God is an always present party to that relationship. And when they say they love one another, that's a way of fostering love of God.
Let's talk about Benjamin Franklin for a moment, because you've mentioned that men and women used fictive kinship to help make their friendship seem more socially acceptable. Franklin proved particularly adept at creating ties of fictive kinship with young and mature women. Would you tell us about his fictive kinship ties and how he used them to navigate his cross-sex friendships?
Franklin is an interesting case because he's certainly known as a flirt, and he was flirtatious. He was absolutely flirtatious. At the same time, a lot of his young female friends, and he's in France in the period he makes a lot of these young female friends, call him mon cher papa, my dear father. And that's kind of interesting that at the same time he's sort of casting himself in this fatherly or avuncular role, he's also flirting with them. And, we don't know if he was actually attracted to these women. He may well have been. That doesn't necessarily mean it wasn't a friendship. But this mix of flirtation and that fictive kin thing actually signals something about anxieties at the time about sexuality and family, more particularly among siblings. But there's a lot of people who are writing about and worried about incest in this period. So that fictive kinship language isn't a foolproof protection against people misinterpreting your relationship. And that's certainly the case with Franklin.
I've never really stopped to think about flirting in the early Republic. I mean, clearly men and women flirted. But was flirting a socially acceptable practice during the early Republic? Or did early Republic men and women largely engage in the practice behind closed doors, perhaps in the safety of their own correspondence?
Within certain bounds, flirting is socially acceptable. And when we think about somebody like Franklin, he's in France, and it's definitely acceptable in the elite circles he's in France, and would have been in England too. Less so in America at this point. So that's partially connected to ideas about sexuality and what marriage should be, and different ideas between Europe and America there. But I think some flirtation is sort of a way of showing wit and intellect in this period, as long as, there are boundaries to it.
Was the United States unique in the way that Americans viewed cross-sex friendships? You mentioned that in France, flirting was socially acceptable, but What about in Great Britain, the Netherlands, and in other countries around the world that interacted with early America? How did other places view cross-sex friendships?
I know the most about how this worked in especially London and Paris, and that's where most of the Americans that were visiting Europe went. There's actually not that much literature in general around the world about friendships between men and women in various historical periods, so it's really hard to get at this. But for England and France, at least, among elites at this time, it was quite common for married people to have affairs. And so there's not the same worry with male-female friendship that there's something inappropriate going on, because if it is an affair, so what? Everybody's having affairs. That's not the case with middle-class or lower-class people. This is really sort of a upper echelon of society where that's happening. But those are the people that the Americans visiting are interacting with, and those are the people that the Americans at home are hearing about. And this is why they are sort of freaked out by the licentious Europeans, and they want a different model in America. They believe they need to be virtuous in order to keep up a democratic republic. And part of that virtue is not having rampant adultery and reining in sexuality. So that, in turn, actually makes these friendships more difficult in America.
You know, I wonder, we've spent a lot of time discussing how cross-sex friendships function between elite men and women, but did cross-sex friendships exist between non-elite men and women too?
You know, I had a really hard time getting at sources on people outside of the sort of white elite, because these are the people that leave the letters and diaries and material objects that are easiest to get to. I do have some middling class people who certainly readers wouldn't have heard of, who, represent somebody outside of the elite a bit. In terms of getting at lower class people, that's a real challenge. And this is something that I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to do, trying to look at court records for things like adultery cases to see if it came up there. Often we can get at lower class people's voices through court records and couldn't get there. So my hope is that another author comes along and can figure out the answer to that question.
So the answer is maybe, but we don't know based on the historical evidence we have available to us in the archives.
Or at least the historical evidence that I could find. I also think that there's a factor here that for elite people, education of women is really valued, and they're not applying that whole ideal of Republican womanhood and intellect to lower class people. And there's also less leisure time for lower class people. So in general, it is harder to sort of get at what their friendships would have been like. And certainly in terms of male-female friendships, on the one hand, there's not this ideal of a Republican woman who can have intellectual conversations with a man. On the other, there are actually fewer worries about sexuality. There's a lot of good work, people like Claire Lyons, who have shown us that actually these people are not prudes, that there is a lot of extramarital sexuality going on. And so maybe it's not as big of a risk for people in the lower class to be friends with the opposite sex.
You know, a couple of times now, you've noted how difficult it was to find out how early American men and women formed and maintained friendships. So, how did you research this topic? What types of historical sources did you use to find information about friendships between early American men and women?
Letters were really the most important source for me, because when friends were separated from one another, they often wrote each other. If they're in person and just having conversations, it's really hard to capture that. Occasionally you get lucky and somebody has written a diary entry where they transcribed an entire conversation, or at least talk about how they feel about a friend of the opposite sex and what that relationship is like. So there's some diaries, but the main source really here was letters. I also was able to get at this through gifts that they exchanged, and that needed to be pieced together with letters too to understand the context of those. So in many ways, it's at these moments of exchange between friends that I'm able to understand and sort of map out how those relationships worked.
What about letters made them such a good source for you? Why were letters an ideal way to form and maintain cross-sex friendships?
Yeah, letters, if you think about the only way to communicate when you're separated at this time, and you don't even have to be very far apart to not be able to get together easily, the only way to communicate is through letters. And letter writing is a huge art in this period, especially growing in the 18th century. There's tons of guides to how to write letters. There's all these model letters of, if you're a father writing a son with advice about his education, what should the letter look like? If you're a daughter writing your father for permission to marry somebody, what should that look like? So there are all these letter writing guides that people are reading at the time, trying to use models of how their letters should look, and at the same time trying to sound natural and express their feeling in letters. There's no models out there, though, for letters between male-female friends. So as with the rules of shaping these relationships, it can be a little challenging. And there's multiple letters where men and women talk about a sort of prohibition of especially unmarried men and women writing one another. They call it things like a foolish prejudice or illiberal custom. And they'll say, there is this foolish prejudice, but I'm writing to you anyway. It's usually men doing that. So they do have to be very careful in their letter writing and understanding that these letters, we think of letters as something pretty private. In this period, they weren't always. They do have a seal on them, but plenty of people could open it along the way and reseal it. When you got a letter, you were often expected to share it with those around you. So the content of that letter needs to be pretty carefully shaped to show that this is a friendship, this is proper.
So, knowing that other people might read their mail, did letters between men and women as friends differ from letters just between women or just between men?
Yeah, absolutely they did. And from married couples or courting couples, they're in general much less effusive. The kind of emotional language they use is different. They're not going to use words like love. Often they'll say something about my heart in a letter of same-sex friendship or romantic letter, and in friendly letters between men and women, that doesn't really come up. Instead, they're going to use words more like esteem and respect and regard, and they're not going to address one another by their first name. Usually they're going to keep it more formal, dear sir or dear madam, and they're not going to sign something like with love. They might in a married couple letter, and actually even friendly letters at this time sound pretty romantic. And in some cases, they probably were romantic. There probably were relationships there that went beyond friendship. So those gradations actually help with understanding when you're looking at letters, okay, is this a letter of friendship? Are these people courting? Are they having an affair? Understanding that emotional vocabulary actually helps unlock the relationship.
In addition to letters and other written sources, you also mentioned that objects, gifts, allowed you to gain insight into the cross-sex friendships that elite men and women formed. Would you tell us about the objects you looked at and about gift exchange? How did gifts allow early American men and women to form and maintain friendships with members of the opposite sex?
Right. So exchanging a gift is part of usually an ongoing sort of cycle of reciprocity. We could think of emotional exchange or intellectual exchange, or more concretely, exchanging letters. And then gifts sort of become part of that flow. And it's a reminder of the other person's presence. It sort of substitutes for an absent friend. And that's particularly the case when you have a portrait. So you actually get to see the person's face. They might also give gifts of silhouettes. They might give poetry, small trinkets, even locks of hair. So there's a variety of gifts. They just have to be really careful in choosing the proper gift, something that will show this is a proper relationship, and shaping that exchange so that the people around them understand this is a friendly gift.
I'm sure we've all been in this situation, right? We receive an unexpected gift from a friend and then wonder, do we need to go out and find a gift to give to our friend? Should we just send them a thank you note? Sometimes the whole process just seems complicated. Did this happen in the early Republic? Did gift giving complicate cross-sex friendships too?
Yeah, I think at times it did. There are times where people misinterpreted what those gifts meant. And so we can see there's an example with the American naval hero John Paul Jones, where he receives a gift. A female friend of his who's an amateur artist paints a miniature of him. And miniatures, unlike portraits, usually were only exchanged in courtship. But this is France. The rules are a little different. He gets this gift of a miniature of himself that she has painted, and he thinks this means she wants to have an affair. So he sends her a letter with a cipher so they can write each other, he says, very freely and without risk, and asks for a miniature of herself that he can wear around his neck. And she sees this and pretty much says, no, that is not what I meant. This was just about friendship. And he tries to downplay it and say, friendship has nothing to do with sex. Pray, what harm is there in wishing to have the picture of a friend? But, he's being a little disingenuous there. So there are times that, yes, this can be pretty complicated.
Your research must have revealed some interesting gifts. What was the most interesting gift that a pair of opposite sex friends exchanged?
I think think the amount of hair that gets exchanged was actually pretty surprising to me. There are multiple locks of hair that show up in all sorts of places, like people's albums, within a letter, could be in a piece of jewelry, and especially George Washington's hair shows up a lot. There's a female friend that he gave a lock of hair to, and I guess it was long enough, she cut it into several pieces and created 3 different jewelry pieces. So then she's able to wear this visual symbol of her friendship with the great George Washington. And this is actually a pretty easy gift for him to give. It's free. It's a fairly inexhaustible resource. And the story goes with her that Martha, just upon her request, walked up to him and cut a lock of hair off and handed it to her, and then added one of her own. So that is a sort of gift that we no longer would give, but was quite common then.
Do we know where the tradition of giving hair came from? Because you're right. We've all gone to museums and we've all seen locks of hair. And it does seem a bit odd to us today that people would exchange hair as a gift.
Yeah, I think that this is a pretty long tradition here because you don't need any particular technology to do this. And you're giving a physical piece of yourself to represent yourself to this friend. So I think this had been going on for a very long time. It sort of accelerates in the 19th century in America, where you get really ornate hair jewelry. You're not getting much of that in the early Republic. And sometimes even that hair was from somebody you didn't know. So hair takes on this sort of aesthetic appeal that it doesn't have for us today, but also a memory value, I think.
At the start of our conversation, we discussed Abigail Adams and Thomas Jefferson, and about how part of the allure for their forming a friendship was a political connection. Would you tell us how political cities like Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, or state capitals like Albany, New York, paved the way for cross-sex friendships? What was it about politics that made cross-sex friendships more acceptable than if they had formed outside of politics?
In some ways, it's actually about political spaces and the spaces of Washington, D.C. in particular, because the city had not been built up much. There were very few social spaces. Most of the men weren't bringing their wives with them, but those that did would bring wives to events. And so you'd have these mixed-sex events with both men and women, and a lot of people who visited remarked that the rules of interaction between men and women are a little looser in Washington. You can't after dinner send one group to the parlor as easily when you have a whole lot of people in a fairly small house. The other issue there is that Congress was open for the public to come in and watch debates. And so women would come, and in fact, we have descriptions of them sitting on the floor of the Senate during the Missouri Compromise debates. They are sharing those political spaces with men, with their male friends. And so that is part of it. The other aspect is if you have these well-educated women, intellectual women, clearly they're going to be interested in the important issues of the day. And so I think that men in politics make particularly attractive friends for them. And so in that way, politics does sort of facilitate these friendships.
It also seems like an environment where women could be go-betweens, where they could be trading news, gossip, and other useful information between politicians to help further their own political ends. Did this happen?
Yes, it was an interesting period because you don't have institutionalized political parties in the same way. You don't have somebody who can automatically round up votes within a party. There's a lot more personal interaction that goes into making politics happen in this period. They're also not sitting in Congress for many hours a day. So again, a lot of the politics is happening in social spaces outside of Congress. And so women have an opportunity to step into that, to become go-betweens, to press their influence, to share information. Especially women who are married to a powerful politician can be a sort of power broker herself. So this does give women political power and bring them into the political process.
You noted how political spaces and places like Washington, D.C. and state capitals were looser in terms of their adherence to social norms. Did these looser spaces create any dangers for opposite-sex friends that they wouldn't have experienced elsewhere?
There was a danger to women appearing to be too political, just like to appear to be too intellectual, because women, it was acceptable for them to talk about politics to a degree, but they weren't supposed to be really visibly, openly involved. They can't give public speeches. No woman is giving public speeches until the 1820s in America. So they have to do this a little more behind the scenes. And for women who seem to be too much in public, too political, that often translated into attacks on her sexuality. And so there are multiple cases where women that have male friends get tarred as being involved in sexual relationships. And part of this just comes from the fact that the term public woman, a woman in public, meant a prostitute. And so there's this crossover between just sheer publicness and sexuality at the time. And it becomes a tool for men to push women out of the political sphere to make these accusations. And so then it does become a little more dangerous for women with male politician friends. They need to be pretty careful about boundaries and how they're shaping that relationship, making sure, extra sure that it appears proper.
Before we move into the time warp, is there anything about the way that men and women formed and maintained friendships in the early republic that informs our present-day traditions of cross-sex friendships?
There's a couple of things there. First, the fact that we have sort of similar biases against male-female friendship, arguing that these friendships are impossible. If we think about the movie When Harry Met Sally, the whole thesis of that movie is men and women can't be friends. And there's so many movies with that plot line. It always ends in a romantic relationship. And these men and women were facing that kind of storyline too. And in fact, other stories telling them it was dangerous, but they formed these friendships anyway. And I think that suggests to us that there's more flexibility in social relationships. If these men and women with all their social constraints were able to do it, surely we can have some more flexibility in our relationships than what's possible now.
Let's move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if Abigail Adams and Thomas Jefferson had not been friends? What insight will we lose about the American Revolution and the early Republic periods without their friendly correspondence?
First, to get to the idea of what might have transpired, because this is actually kind of intriguing. When Jefferson first met Abigail, they were living in Paris. They were both there. John Adams had a diplomatic post there, as did Jefferson. The Adams leave for another diplomatic post in London, and Jefferson decides to bring his younger daughter over to Europe, his daughter Polly. And when he decides to do that, she has to come into England. Somebody needs to meet her there. And the whole plan, the crux of Jefferson's plan, is that his daughter and a slave who's accompanying her will come to London. Abigail Adams will take care of them for a little while until they can make their way to France. And what happens is she does, in fact, do that, and they make their way to France, and the slave accompanying his daughter is Sally Hemings. And from what we know, especially from Annette Gordon-Reed, that's when Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings happens. So if Jefferson had not been friends with Abigail Adams, I'm not sure what would have happened in terms of bringing his daughter over and whether he would have done it, what the timing would have been, how that could have changed things. So that is kind of an interesting hypothetical. In a broader sense, in terms of the insights we get, the nice thing with the Jefferson-Abigail Adams friendship is we have both sides of their correspondence. And that's fairly rare for these relationships, and it's a pretty extensive correspondence. So we get a lot of insights into male-female friendships from them. We also get insights into what they're like as people. We can see Abigail Adams here as fiercely political and opinionated, even with a man who had expressed to other women that he thought women should have nothing to do with politics. On the other hand, we see that even though he says this, he is willing to talk politics with women. I suppose in his case it was if it was the right woman, and Abigail was one of those. You also see just a really witty and likable personality on both sides. We can relate to them as people when we read these letters. So in that sense, these personal letters of friendship, like a lot of other personal letters, let us see another side of people that have been gone for hundreds of years.
So what comes after friendship? What aspect of the early American Republic are you researching and writing about now?
Well, when I was working on this book, I came across several people who were the next generation of George Washington's family. And I was really surprised because I had no idea who they were. I had no idea what had happened to his family, who his family was, beyond the fact that I knew he didn't have children. And I started looking into it, and there actually hasn't been a whole lot written about them. And I think they have a lot to show, again, about how the personal and political match up in this period or how they're intertwined. So I'm doing a family biography of Washington's descendants that'll go up through around the Civil War period and look at how family and politics were connected, how the family shaped their public image and what they thought their public role should be, also what worries the public might have had about descendants of the first president being involved in public life.
Cassie, I know you're all over the internet, but where is the best place or places for us to go and connect with you if we still have questions about friendship during the early Republic?
So I am on Twitter at Cass A. Good, and I tweet about history regularly there. I also have a website that is cassandragood.wordpress.com, and that links to lots of different popular articles on places like Smithsonian.com that I've written, and I keep that up to date with where I'm giving talks, so that is a great place to look.
Cassandra Good, thank you for helping us explore the intricacies of cross-sex friendships in the early American Republic.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Forming and maintaining friendships can be complicated. This is true in our present day just as much as it was true in the early Republic. Of course, if you lived in the early Republic and wanted to be friends with a member of the opposite sex, you'd have to find ways to show all your friends and family that you were indeed just friends and not romantic partners. Men and women demonstrated the platonic nature of their cross-sex friendships in several ways. Some interacted with their friends only within the confines of a church. Some allowed their spouse and perhaps everyone else in their family to read their mail. And some couched their sentiments of friendship in terms of fictive kinship. This means that they showed everyone what they really thought about, say, their friend Benjamin Franklin, that he was more of a father or uncle figure, not a lover. For some elite men and women of the early Republic, it seems that forming and maintaining friendships with members of the opposite sex was totally worth all the social hoops they had to jump through. Abigail Adams and Thomas Jefferson certainly thought so. They enjoyed a long and fruitful friendship, where they challenged each other intellectually, consulted each other on matters of family, and consoled each other at moments of profound loss. You can find information about Cassie, her book Founding Friendships, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/094. Don't forget to join the listener community on Facebook. In another day or so, I will be hosting a giveaway of books we've explored on the show, will explore on the show, or for whatever reason, didn't fit the show. They're all new or gently used, and they're all looking for a good home. To join the community, text BF World to 33444 or visit benfranklinsworld.com and click on the orange Join Now button on the home screen. Finally, what more about everyday life in the early Republic would you like to know about? Send your answers to Liz at benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me at Liz Covart, or post a comment on the show notes page for this episode or in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.